when power knocks on the door of the states. They say the true test of a nation is not when all is at peace, but when power decides to test its own limits. And that's exactly what happened when Donald Trump announced he would send the National Guard to Chicago. At first glance, it seemed like a security measure, but a closer look revealed something much bigger at stake. A clash between law and power, between authority and autonomy. Between Washington and the heart of the states, Illinois reacted as few would dare. It sued the president. And this simple action became a political earthquake capable of shaking the foundations of the American Federation. The contradiction is glaring. Can a government that promises to protect the people simultaneously violate the freedoms it claims to defend? When order comes from above, but resistance arises from below, the country finds itself torn between the need for security and the fear of authoritarianism. It's a classic paradox of American history, and, at the same time, a perfect snapshot of our times. Behind the fiery speeches, sensationalist headlines, and calculated tweets lurk power strategies, legal maneuvering, and a quiet war for narrative. It's not just about troops in Chicago. It's about who really runs the nation when the voltage reaches the limit. And that's where this story takes on a fascinating twist. The state that dared to defy the president now becomes a symbol of resistance, and the president who promised to restore order finds himself accused of overstepping the bounds of the Constitution. Between decrees and lawsuits, tanks and courts, what's unfolding before our eyes is more than a political crisis. It's a living chapter in the eternal struggle for power on American soil. But before understanding what Illinois challenged, we need to understand what Trump actually tried to do, and what motivated him to do it. So now it's time to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what's coming will surprise you. The spark. What sparked the Illinois-Trump conflict? When a president speaks of security, a state thinks of freedom. And it is from this friction that the voltage. The trigger was the White House's decision to federalize and send the National Guard to Chicago, after weeks of federal operations and protests that ignited the law and order versus state autonomy debate. Illinois and the city responded by filing a lawsuit to block the plan, marking the dispute between federal power and local government. Meanwhile, the memory was fresh. A judge had already blocked a similar shipment to Portland, which raised the political temperature in the Midwest. It's the age-old question of rule of law. How far does Washington's pen go when it crosses the county line? Behind the scenes, the operational design also played a role. Officials confirmed that troops departed Texas for Illinois, with numbers ranging in the hundreds, enough to change the mood on the streets and the news every hour. At the same time, Chicago's mayor issued an order creating ice-free zones in city buildings and parks, a clear message about local limits to federal action. For the average resident, this translates into a tense routine. Businesses closing early, parents changing school routes, neighborhood leaders trying to calm the chorus. To understand this story, 3 guiding questions. What is the legal basis? What is the proportionality? And what is the measurable objective of the measure? On paper, the spark turned into a legal fire. The state attorney general, Kwame Raoul, filed a lawsuit questioning the legality of the federalization of the Guard for police duties, while Illinois and Chicago sought an urgent injunction, which a judge initially granted. Result: troops on the way and the institutional board wide open, with the narrative fighting over every comma. For those following closely, it's worth noting the hearing schedule, the constitutional arguments, Insurrection Act, the governor's appointment of the Guard, and the metrics, security used by the government. And here's the question. How exactly does Illinois strategize in the process, and why certain words in the request can be game-changing? The Illinois response, the lawsuit that became a symbol of resistance. Illinois reacted quickly, almost as if it had expected the blow. The Attorney General's office, Kwame Raoul, convened a legal task force to study every line of the Constitution and determine how far a president can go without violating the Federative Pact. The process was not just an institutional defense, it was a political statement. The state would not accept the deployment of the National Guard without local consent. The governor reinforced the same tone on public television, stating that Chicago needs social investment, not soldiers on street corners. This statement echoed across social media, became a headline, and within hours became a symbol of civil resistance. What many people forget is that the dispute wasn't just a partisan whim. Behind the lawsuit were concrete principles: state autonomy, separation of powers, and civilian control over the armed forces. Constitutional lawyers noted that the Insurrection Act of 1807, often used as a basis, only applies in extreme situations, such as armed insurrections. Chicago, although facing alarming levels of violence, did not fall under this category. The state argued that Trump's decision was a political maneuver disguised as a security measure, trying to project a steady-hand image in an election year. The court then became the stage for a dispute that transcended the law. It had become a reflection of America's divided soul. Meanwhile, the streets of Chicago became a barometer of national tension. Protesters carried signs with slogans like "Not our troops" and "Protect our city, not your campaign." For many residents, the lawsuit symbolized more than a legal document. It was a fight for preservation of local democracy. And behind the scenes, something even more interesting was happening. Groups of legal scholars and law professors from universities like Northwestern and UChicago began to unite in public support of the state, publishing manifestos and critical analyses of the risks of domestic militarization. That's where a bigger movement exists. When law and society come together, resistance gains a voice. And what began as a legal reaction begins to take on the contours of national movement. Chicago in the eye of the storm. Fear, politics, and boiling streets. Chicago became the epicenter of a war fought not just with laws, but with narratives. On the streets, the atmosphere was reminiscent of the 1960s. Helicopters hovering over entire neighborhoods, police cars in convoys, and civilians divided between fear and anger. For some business owners, the presence of the National Guard represented security and stability. For others, it was a vivid reminder of a country still struggling with authoritarianism, disguised as order. Conversations in coffee shops and bus stops revolved around a disturbing question: are we more protected or more under surveillance? The city breathed a heavy air, a mixture of uncertainty and challenge that only Chicago can handle. The protests grew in number and intensity. Young people with megaphones, mothers with signs, and veterans reminiscing about times gone by marched side by side on Michigan Avenue. Local police struggled to balance control without further inflaming the population. At the same time, community leaders began organizing to protect neighborhoods, forming civic committees, mediation, and information, trying to prevent misinformation from spreading panic. One South Side pastor even said, "Fear fuels bad decisions. We need calm, not thuggery." This phrase went viral, echoing as a reminder that true public safety begins with dialogue, not with weapons. But what few saw was the psychological impact of this situation. Entire families slept to the sound of sirens and woke to alarmist headlines. Schools debated whether to suspend in-person classes, and companies began releasing employees early. Chicago found itself once again torn between the desire to order and the cry for freedom, a duality as old as the country itself. It is at this point that some facts stand out. Crises like this reveal not only political flaws, but also emotional ones: how much society tolerates fear in the name of security. And what seemed to be just a conflict between Trump and Illinois has now become a mirror of America, a portrait of polarization and distrust that no one knew for sure how to cure. Trump's rhetoric, national security or political maneuver. Trump has always known how to turn crises into a platform. From the first announcement about the deployment of the National Guard, his speech was framed as a heroic act, a president protecting the people when states fail. This narrative, which appealed to fear and a sense of urban chaos, was not new. He used it as a tool of power, a way to reaffirm his image as strong and uncompromising leader. At rallies, he promised to restore order, while on social media he posted looping videos of vandalism and violence, creating the impression of a city in collapse. The problem? Many of the videos weren't even from Chicago, but the psychological impact was spot on. Public opinion was divided, and that was all he needed. Presidential rhetoric has always played a fundamental role in American history, but Trump has elevated it to spectacle. He understands that modern politics is more about narratives rather than facts, and while Illinois reacted legally, it reacted mediatically, turning the dispute into a battle of hashtags. Law and order wasn't just a slogan. It was a political marketing strategy, tested and refined to reach patriotic hearts and insecure minds. Republican allies echoed the rhetoric on TV shows, while Democratic governors mobilized to deny what they called a manipulation campaign. In the power structure, the deployment of the National Guard was more than security. It was an electoral chess move. Behind the rhetoric lay calculation. Close aides knew that each explosive statement generated waves of support and fury, and both were useful. It's a fact that in times of uncertainty, those who dominate the discourse dominate the scene. Trump exploited the sentiment of nostalgia and fear, portraying himself as the only one capable of saving America from itself. For many analysts, the central question was not whether Chicago was under threat, but whether the nation was under a war of perception. After all, when fear is well narrated, it becomes belief. And this belief shapes votes, decisions, and even the very notion of truth. Behind the scenes of power, the political chess behind the decision. In the halls of Washington, nothing is random. Behind the fiery talk about security, there was a much more sophisticated game at play, a true political chess. Trump's close advisors knew that every military decision on domestic soil had profound repercussions for swing states, the famous swing states, which would decide the upcoming elections. Sending troops to Chicago, a Democratic stronghold, served to trigger an emotional response among its conservative voters. See what happens when the left governs. It was a move designed not only to solve an urban crisis, but to cement a national narrative, that of the president confronting blue chaos. Politics, after all, is the stage where every gesture is calculated to the millimeter. As Illinois prepared to argue in court, strategists in Washington were drawing up plans to convert the episode into political capital. Communications consultants studied public reaction, adjusting campaign speeches based on engagement and sentiment metrics. Every Trump tweet was accompanied by real-time analytics, measuring the impact on veterans, law enforcement, and rural communities, three crucial constituencies. When a leader acts under the watchful eye of an algorithm, reality becomes raw material for narrative. Thus, deploying the National Guard was not just an administrative response, but also a move to occupy the collective imagination with the image of strength, discipline, and patriotism. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was one of theater and strategy. While generals calculated logistical routes, marketers calculated opinion routes. Political analysts pointed out that tensions in Chicago could be amplified to justify future exceptional measures, paving the way for a discourse of national restoration. It was as if the board was set far beyond Illinois. With every move, there was the risk of checks, legal, political, and moral. True power struggles are rarely fought on the battlefield. They take place in decision rooms where a pen is worth more than a tank. The next step? Understanding how the public judged this game and how Trump's image began to oscillate between hero and tyrant. The judgment of public opinion. Hero or tyrant? Public opinion turned the episode into a veritable moral tribunal. On one side, there were those who saw Trump as a defender of the law, a man willing to restore order in the face of the alleged negligence of local authorities. On the other hand, a crowd saw autocrat disguised as a patriot, testing the limits of American democracy. Social media became a battleground. Hashtags, videos, and inflammatory speeches multiplied at a dizzying pace. Each statement from the president gained dozens of interpretations, and the debate stopped being about security. It became about who has the right to command at this point. The legal conflict became psychological, a war for hearts and minds. In Chicago, the emotional impact was palpable. Ordinary citizens began discussing politics as if it were football, with passion, anger, and fear. Radio shows, podcasts, and local newspapers gave space to divided voices. The police officer who supported sending in the troops, the teacher who feared for civil liberties, the businessman who saw the intervention as a return to the era of racial confrontations. This kind of division doesn't arise by chance. It's cultivated. And when the people fragment, central power grows stronger. Trump knew this. He fueled polarization as campaign fuel, while every citizen, without realizing it, became a pawn in this great emotional board. Opinion polls showed curious numbers. Approval ratings were rising among his most loyal voters. Among independents and moderates, they were falling. The country seemed to be splitting in half, and the media, instead of calming the debate, amplified it. Conservative channels spoke of a restoration of authority, while progressive outlets denounced attempts at domestic militarization. The confusion was so great that even experts wondered where reality ended and narrative began. Trump's trial was taking place not only in the courts, but in the American collective consciousness. And while people debated on screens and at bars, a larger question lingered. How divided can a nation become before it begins to unravel? The weight of history. When states face Washington. Nothing that happened in Illinois is entirely new. American history is marked by clashes between federal power and the states, a tension that dates back to the early days of the Republic. From the Civil War to the fight for civil rights, including the immigration and health crises, the United States faces a perennial dilemma. Who has the final say, Washington or the local people? Illinois now carries the brunt of this long-standing dispute. In 1963, Alabama attempted to block federal troops sent by Kennedy to ensure the enrollment of black students. Decades later, Arizona confronted Obama on immigration. In each case, the conflict served as a moral mirror for the country, revealing the depth of state autonomy is fragile when politics overrides the Constitution. The similarity is striking. Whenever the central power feels threatened, it tends to expand its presence under the guise of national security. Trump has simply rewritten the script, but with a contemporary twist, that of social networks as a battlefield historically, presidents resort to force to assert authority, while governors resort to legality to preserve autonomy. Lincoln, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Nixon, all to a greater or lesser extent, faced this dilemma. The Illinois case is another piece in this timeline, but the current context is unprecedented. An era of digital polarization, where narratives circulate faster than facts. And, in this scenario, whoever dominates history dominates power. What makes this dispute iconic is the symbolism behind it. Illinois wasn't just challenging an executive order. It was defending the principle that no leader is above the institutions, and this touches on the essence of the American experiment. What's at stake is not just security policy, but the very balance of the federal system. It's as if the country, cyclically, needs to test the limits of its democracy to remember why it exists. And while jurists, governors, and presidents wage battles in the courts, history watches silently, recording who used power to protect and who used it to dominate. But a question still lingers. What will be the practical and political consequences of this confrontation for the future? Political and institutional consequences. What comes next? Illinois' lawsuit against Trump's intervention didn't end in court. It set a legal and political precedent that could redefine the relationship between states and the federal government. Constitutional law experts have begun to debate the true scope of the Insurrection Act, questioning whether a president can actually send troops without state consent in situations that don't involve armed insurrection. This debate has gone beyond Illinois. Governors in California, New York, and even Texas, albeit for different reasons, have begun revising their own emergency laws. The case has become a national alert, a stress test for American democracy. Politically, the episode left visible scars. Trump consolidated his most loyal base, who saw him as the only one capable of acting in the face of what they called urban anarchy. Meanwhile, Democratic-governed states hardened their stance against the central government, strengthening regional alliances and interstate cooperation pacts. In Congress, the clash reignited discussions about limits on executive power, military funding, and the role of the armed forces domestically. Analysts noted that, even after his term ended, the decisions made during that period continued to resonate, affecting trust in institutions and shaping the political behavior of future administrations. But the most profound impact was symbolic. Illinois, in standing up to the federal government, became an icon of modern resistance. A reminder that democracy only lives when it is challenged. Chicago, which at first seemed merely a stage for conflict, has emerged as a metaphor for the entire nation, a city divided, yet still searching for balance. In politics, every action leaves a legacy, and in this case, the legacy is a country more alert, more suspicious, and paradoxically, more aware of the value of its freedom. And while the Capitol lights remain on, a question echoes through the corridors of power. Who, after all, controls America's future? The people, the states, or fear? When power finds its own limits. Ultimately, the Illinois versus Trump case wasn't just a legal battle. It was a mirror of the American soul itself, a country that prides itself on freedom, but that, every now and then, needs to remember how far power can go before it begins to destroy it. Every hearing, every impassioned speech, and every patrol on the streets of Chicago revealed the same dilemma that has plagued humanity since the beginning of time: the fear of losing control. And perhaps that's the true lesson. When power moves out of balance, the nation trembles, but it's in that tremor that it discovers its firmest foundations. In politics, the most dangerous thing is not overt authoritarianism, but authoritarianism disguised as protection. When fear becomes an argument and order becomes a pretext, democracy begins to crumble at the edges. Therefore, every citizen who follows stories like this needs to ask themselves, what do I stand for when I choose a leader? Security or freedom? Loyalty or truth? Politics isn't just made in palaces. It begins in the conversations, opinions, and silent decisions of each individual who chooses to see beyond the rhetoric. And if this story made you think, reflect, or even question your own beliefs about power and freedom, then it has already served its purpose. Knowledge is the only weapon that doesn't hurt, but awakens. And if you want to continue understanding the behind-the-scenes of world politics, the power plays, and the decisions that shape our time, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the next stories will show that, behind every headline, there is always something much bigger at stake. And understanding this is the first step to never again being manipulated by fear.